Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Inside Sports Studio. I'm your host, Charles E. Smith Jr. This is a special production here of Inside Sports. We're going to talk a little bit of NBA. We're going to talk mostly NHL hockey and maybe a little NFL if we have time. So first of all, let me go ahead and bring in my very talented co-host for this show. And many of you know him well. You may follow him on Twitter at Andrew Knoll NHL. There's my homeboy, Andrew Knoll. What's happening?
It's always a pleasure to be here on the Bald and the Beautiful, and just hanging out, trying to enjoy the off season. We had a very busy postseason, doing some work for the New York Times out here with the Western Conference playoffs, and just itching to get on your show. I'm glad you finally had me for the first time in a while here.
Yeah, that's it. Well, we used to tear it up back in the day doing our shows directly from Staples Center, talking NHL hockey. So, you mentioned, and you've done a lot of things. You mentioned doing a little bit of work for New York Times. What's the latest here on Andrew Knoll?
Well, definitely looking forward to continuing that relationship next year, doing some of the outdoor games, and a lot of Western Conference hockey. I'll still be based out here in LA, working that, and trying not to let the sun bake my brain too much. You got to get inside at the rink. I'm looking forward to that decamp coming up for the Kings for sure.
All right, so it's the sun that's been baking your brain. Okay, I get it, man. I get it.
Sure, we'll go with that.
All right, well, let's go ahead and start with the NHL. And, of course, the big story, was Ilya Kovalchuk. Of course, Kovalchuk signed that big deal with the Devils, and then he walks away from the remaining 11 years and $77 million and decides to go back to the KHL, or not back, but goes to the KHL, play there in Russia. So, it was initially they talked about him leaving the Devils kind of in a lurch, not honoring that contract. But in the long run, how do you see that? Might it be something that actually works out well for both sides involved?
Well, I think it's something that works out famously for both sides involved. Kovalchuk has competed intermittently in the KHL, and he can go there, be a dominant player, earn an enormous tax-free paycheck, and be close to his family, be close to home. I mean, that's the obvious reasoning for the deal. But a lot of people, I think, were consoling Devils fans, and many of them were understandably upset. You have a guy who is almost undoubtedly at this point kind of the face of your franchise, with Martin Brodeur getting on in age, and a guy who they backed over Zach Parise, who was a huge free agent signing for Minnesota last summer. But you look at that, you look at the lost draft picks as a result of that whole rigmarole with the contract, all that's in the past. What was in the future for a relationship with the Devils and Kovalchuk was $77 million in salary, considerably more in cap hits, and no real good way through either a compliance buyout or a straight-out amnesty type provision to get rid of that money. And he wasn't earning even his cap hit, let alone his actual salary, when you look at the sum of his performance there and kind of the mismatch for the Devils franchise. So I think while nobody would admit it, the Devils are moving on, getting back to doing things their way, and are in a very promising position, particularly with the offseason they had otherwise. So, very counterintuitive situation where your marquee player departs and kind of leaves you hanging ostensibly, and really it couldn't have gone much better for the franchise. I mean, the contract is voided. They're going to have to pay about $250,000 in cap space a year, and that's it. So they can reinvest. This is the NHL, not the NBA, where stars are changing hands, good players are moving around. I think their team will be better for it, not only in the long run, but in pretty short order.
Right. Well, the other thing is of course, their other big move you talked about was them getting Cory Schneider from the Vancouver Canucks. Finally, now Martin Brodeur, I remember Richard Brodeur playing for the Vancouver Canucks back in the early 80s. But Martin Brodeur finally will have maybe a successor there in net, which they were really needing to get. But this speaks volumes not only about the Devils, that's one side. We know why they got Schneider, but when you look at the mess that Mike Gillis caused there in Vancouver with his whole issue with Roberto Luongo and Schneider, and now he winds up trading Schneider to New Jersey. Talk to me.
Well, I think it's a contrast of two GMs and two franchises. On one hand, you have Lou Amarillo, who's in a position where he's dealing with what you could call maybe not a middle market team, being in the New York metro state area, but it's kind of the third club there. That's kind of how they operate financially, whereas Mike Gillis is in a position where he's in a hockey-crazed market, a very high-income market, and where they're the only show in town. He's got the full backing, and yet still we see the Devils appearing in the finals, putting banners up in the rafters, and Canucks still looking for number one. And this deal exemplifies that. I mean, you see Lamoriello, after seemingly years of kind of sitting on his thumbs as far as the, goaltending situation went. They weren't drafting goaltenders. They weren't looking for successors. They weren't really developing particularly strong guys. They typically had veteran backups. And now here in, really magnificent, opportunistic move, he comes in and gets Schneider because Luongo's contract is too onerous to move, and they don't want to send Schneider anywhere in the Western Conference. I mean, had they dealt with Edmonton, they would have gotten a stronger offer by almost all accounts. They wanted to go to the East, and there was Lou waiting to snatch him up. So, I mean, magnificent move for the Devils. You look at the Canucks and Mike Gillis, and they're talking to him about that trade. I think those deeds of profuse sweat said it all. I mean, he is under the gun there. If they don't perform this season with the coaching change and all the other moves they made, he may have to punch up the old resume.
Yeah, there you go. An interesting coaching change, too, when you have the Rangers and the Vancouver Canucks basically just swapping coaches. I mean, Vigneault goes to New York, and you got Tortorella comes out here to Vancouver. So it's, you know what? Let's take over each other's underperforming franchises and see what's happening there. How do you see that move anyways? What do you think for the Rangers with Vigneault over there?
I think Alain Vigneault did a tremendous job in Vancouver. I definitely don't think he could be faulted, particularly 2 years ago when you look at the run they had. They came within a game. They had some elements of their team that were falling apart, mostly due to guys playing with pretty serious injuries, things like that, and they were still right on the cusp. I think he did an excellent coaching job overall. It's just been a matter of, kind of tough breaks and circumstance, and getting a fresh start for him in New York is going to be fabulous. Conversely, Tortorella obviously has a very strong track record of his own. They want to get a level of discipline in there that, they think he can bring maybe at a little bit higher level than Vigneault did, but it remains to be seen. Of course, I will find it interesting as a member of the news media how he handles the Canadian media, because if he thought New York was a fierce hockey market, he's maybe in for a bit of a surprise in Vancouver.
Well, the good thing, at least he's not in Toronto, which is really brutal, as we know. Let's
I
go
can't imagine Torts in Toronto.
Let's stay in the East over there. And, one team we need to talk about is the Pittsburgh Penguins. When we look at the, what they did in the playoffs this year, kind of stumbling against the Islanders, getting by Ottawa, but then against the Bruins, the sweep and only getting 2 goals. And with all the firepower they seemingly have on the roster, what's going on there in Pittsburgh? And one thing is we know how good Crosby is, we know how great Malkin is, but it seems like, what is it going to take to get the best out of Evgeny Malkin when Sidney Crosby is in the lineup?
I mean, they're a team with so many paradoxes. You have Malkin playing at a very high level when Crosby's absent. They can't seem to get going at the same time. We've seen them click together a little bit on the power play, but you never see the real strong production from both of them at even strength at the same time. Similarly, their whole team makeup. I mean, they've been able to reconcile having that firepower and having a defensive mentality under both Michel Therrien and now Dan Bylsma at different times, but the past 2 seasons it hasn't been there. Their goaltending falls apart late in the season. Their defense has not had a lot of sandpaper. I mean, grit on defense right now is probably the most coveted commodity in the NHL, even if it's not the highest paid commodity. And
right.
It's something that they've definitely lacked. Obviously they had to bring back guys like Letang and fair terms, and they weren't going to replace them with anybody better. But do you really see that team intimidating anybody? And as we saw in the playoffs, you can't rely on just outscoring people. They were creating chances against Boston, and to their credit, they played fairly well on the defensive end at times. But, you're not going to win every game 6-5. That seems to be kind of their approach.
Well, I think one thing, getting Rob Scuderi back, who left the Kings. You know, he was a member of their 2009 Stanley Cup championship team, then came out here to L.A., wound up winning the Cup with L.A. here in 2012. But getting Scuderi back there on defense is going to add that little bit of that grit that you're talking about.
Well, that's what they're hoping, and, you know, you couldn't find a much more reliable commodity than Rob Scuderi. Obviously, we've both seen him day in and day out during his tenure with the Kings. Extremely consistent, extremely hard-working defenseman that, you know, does all the creditless things. He'll get down into the crease, he'll go into the corners, he'll take punishment. Obviously, we saw him last year in the playoffs with his nose kind of exploding there. He missed about half a shift. You know, very gritty player, and they were very fortunate to find him in a position where he wasn't looking for every single cent he could get on the open market. Rather, he was looking for a competitive situation and a familiar situation, which he found there.
Okay, and, you know, let's go ahead and move over to one of their main rivals, which is the Philadelphia Flyers, as they always tend to battle for the supremacy of Pennsylvania. But the Flyers, looking at, and there you go, again, a team with a lot of firepower in the lineup. But it came down to this past season, how do you have a team with that much talent on the roster and they wind up not even being a playoff team? I mean, the Philadelphia Flyers, what's going on there in Philly?
Well, this is another perverse situation. Maybe there's some sort of wave wafting through Pennsylvania here, but you look at a situation there where going into the season, people said, well, they probably need to add a defenseman. How are they in goal? They blocked a ton of shots. Their penalty kill was pretty effective. Brizgalov maybe gave him mixed results under those circumstances, but he started almost every single game. I don't think you could point to him. Of course, he's now gone there, but the cause of their woes, I mean, they weren't scoring. They were not consistent at all on the power play. You saw a number of their guys drop precipitously in points. You didn't see Giroux be a dominant offensive player. You saw guys like Couturier and Shen really kind of staying static. I mean, you just feel like they, other than Voracek, they never really got going offensively. I think that's a problem that will maybe work itself out. What they need to look at, you know, even more so than the Penguins, is their running gun strategy. I mean, they brought it up from Carolina with Peter Laviolette. It served them very well at times, but odds are they're going to have to tighten up a little if they want to have a more consistent team and a rapid return to the playoffs. But as you said, the talent is certainly there.
Right, and that's the thing is that when you look at Philadelphia, the standard has always been with the Flyers as a franchise is it's not about making the playoffs. The key is to get to that cup final and win another cup for the first time since they did the repeat back in 74-75. I think they've made 6 trips to the cup final since then, but they've all been fruitless. So they've been on the edge, and it looks like they can get back to that on-the-edge point right now, but some things are going to have to change there. Maybe, you know, is Laviolette the right coach? And also, Ron Hextall going out there, assistant GM, was the assistant GM in L.A. for the past 7 years, now going back out to Philly where he became a star back in 86, 87 as a rookie. But Ron Hextall in the front office there in Philly now.
Yeah, absolutely. I think Ron was very pleased to return, and he's had his roots there the whole way. His family is still out east, and professionally it's a solid move for him, even though it may appear to be a lateral move in the short term. I think the comfort level of Dean Lombardi in Los Angeles is maybe slightly higher than that of Paul Holmgren. So if he's looking at it as a potential successor, you know, maybe that was a motivating factor in the move. But certainly the familiarity, and also I think what Hextall can bring to the Flyers. I mean, he's very strong in terms of player development, and he's kind of a big picture guy. Holmgren, I think, has made a lot of very penny thrifty moves. Like the Vincent LeCavalier signing was excellent. They now get a big pivot in the middle. They got him at a very fair term. We've seen him manage assets very well in terms of re-signing guys and then moving them soon after, kind of flipping them for an upgrade. But, you know, for all of those, you see a little bit of pound foolishness because the whole picture hasn't come together. You know, that's not all Homer's fault. I think there's a fair amount of things that have come down from the top, particularly regarding the whole Brizgalov saga, which now has sort of come to a close. We'll see. I mean, Hextall, I think, is an asset to them in the position he's in, but certainly you could see him not too far down the line maybe bumping up to that top level.
There you go. And, of course, we got to talk about the other team that's been at the forefront there in the Eastern Conference. We talked Rangers a little bit. We talked about Philly, Penguins. But how about the Boston Bruins? Cup final this year where they one of the most amazing final series that you'll ever see. But Boston did come up on the short end of that. And then the big trade, Tyler Seguin leaving town. But how do you see the Bruins?
I think the Bruins are the unqualified winner of this past offseason. I don't think you saw any team, especially a good team, improve itself in the way that they did. With the cap going down, most good teams were just trying to kind of tread water, shed salary. They had goals that weren't as ambitious as they typically would be for a competitive franchise, a big market franchise, what have you. But Boston didn't seem to be affected by that. We saw them, first off, lock down two key elements of their team in Patrice Bergeron and Tuukka Rask for a very long period of time, I believe 8 and 7 years, respectively. And we saw them bring in Louis Eriksson, a very fine two-way player, somebody who, if Eastern Conference fans aren't familiar, is a bit of a Marian Hossa light, very strong two-way player, speed, creativity, skill. And they also kind of traded one old guy for a little bit less old guy. His Yager's probably on his way out there, and they brought in Jerome Iginla after all. So, what Iginla has left in the tank, we're not sure, but if he's motivated, we've seen him play at an extremely, not so much motivated, but in peak physical condition, which he always strives to be, and we've seen him be a tremendous asset in the playoffs during his years in Calgary. I really, really like what the Bruins did. If I were placing odds on the Stanley Cup champion, the only thing that would make me a little bit hesitant to put them as a favorite would be the fact that they did have such a deep run, and this is a very short offseason. Short of that, on paper, they have an incredible team.
Yeah, and the thing about Iginla is that when you got to look at what team he would fit with, and when I look at the style that Iginla plays, Iginla has always played that north to south, hard-nosed type of style, and it seems like his style would be a perfect fit for the Bruins. Like you said, the only thing is what exactly does he have left in the tank? That's the concern. He didn't really fit there in Pittsburgh, but it seems like the whole north-south thing with Boston, it should be a good fit for Iginla.
Absolutely. I also think the 48-game schedule was really difficult for a lot of veteran players. I know you and I have definitely encountered that in talking to Teemu Selanne, and while Iginla is maybe not quite Teemu's peer, he's up there. It's tough, even for a guy as fit, as solid, and as meticulous as he's been throughout his career, and particularly as he's gotten older. If you don't have it, you don't have it. And I think at the end of the year, there were a number of nights where he didn't have it. Now he'd be a little bit insulated. He'll have the full schedule to deal with. And, I think he'll step in and do very well, basically stepping in for Nathan Horton, who departed on a huge, long contract. There's a guy who's there on a one-year deal and really motivated to kiss that cup for the first time. Yep,
there you go. So Jerome Iginla working there. And, one thing we got to talk about a little bit here before we go is, since we're both based out here on the West Coast, Los Angeles Kings, the Anaheim Ducks, but let's go ahead and talk about the Kings here. Rob Blake expected to be named assistant GM here at some point this week, but where do you see the Kings? Just 1 year removed from that cup, but are they that far away from being, getting back to that level?
No, not at all. Well, they weren't that far away from being back at that level last season,
right,
reaching the conference finals with a club that was really, if not riddled by injuries in the sense that they were losing man games, certainly beat up. You saw guys out there that weren't performing at capacity, and, even with the layoff, you just saw the toll of going so far, all the way last year, and then having another deep run after a condensed schedule this year kind of take its toll. I think going into next year, they've got to be one of the favorites in the Western Conference, and a lot hinges on the health and presence of Willie Mitchell, whom I thought they were kind of scrambling all of last year to replace and never fully did.
Exactly. And then, so you got to think about the Kings, and then also Chicago this time, though they did jettison a few players, at least this time, unlike 2010, they did at least keep their goaltender, which is always a good thing to do.
Well, one of them. They kept one of their goaltenders. Ray Emery was a pretty big part of their success during the regular season last year, but Pearl was their guy in the playoffs.
Mm-hmm.
I think that the key thing there was that they did a pretty similar, changeover of their team as they did after the last time they won the Stanley Cup. But what they learned from that was that a big body in front of the net that carves out space for his line mates is not always an easy thing to replace. So where they let Dustin Byfuglien go last time, they kind of bent over backwards to keep Brian Bickle this time. And with their core intact, I mean, they should be very competitive. Again, they've got the same thing to worry about as the Bruins with that very quick turnaround after a long season. But short of that, they have a rather impressive roster returning.
All right, there you go. All right, Mr. Knoll, we had a lot of fun here today, and I know we had said we were going to talk a little bit of NBA, but we'll have to do that next time because we're just about out of time here.
That sounds like a plan, Charles. Anytime you'd like to have me back to talk some Orange, it'd be my pleasure.
All right, fantastic. So, of course, everybody, you can follow Andrew at Andrew Knoll, KNOLL, on Twitter, and you can follow me on Twitter at The Inside Sports. And, of course, Andrew, we want to get together during the regular season here, do a few broadcasts maybe from Staples Center and just keep abreast of everything in the NHL because nothing like getting on there, swapping knowledge with you, and raising the collective hockey IQ of the public out there.
I aim to please, I aim to educate.
Okay, may I quote you?
You'll have to take out the profanity for most of the things I say, but short of that, sure, I may have said 2 or 3 sentences that are fit to print at some point in my life.
All right, fantastic. Well, all right, thanks for joining me. So for Andrew Knoll, I'm Charles E. Smith, Jr. This has been an Inside Sports production, and we will see you next time. Remember, when the NFL starts, we'll be doing my weekly show, Football Talk with Chris Lardieri. Until then, we'll see you.